so this is just, I guess, a general informal discussion. The topics specifically are criminalization of HIV non-disclosure, queerness, and housing protections, as well as, I guess, the legalese of transitioning.
Hi, my name is Violetta Nikolskaya. That when we think about the idea of protection with regards to housing, the first thing we have to think about is how well do we know the problem? How well do we know the issues that are impacting individuals and all the different intersections of individuals? That includes youth, that includes adults, that includes parents, that includes seniors. So we know, so if we think about that particular representation, that's very, very large. So it's very large considering how much we understand LGBTQ people to represent in our population as a whole. The last time that the City of Toronto Street Needs Assessment did one, they found in their survey it was about 20%, which is still very, very high. So even if it's not as high as 40%, which was once estimated in Hamilton, we still know that across Ontario there's a very high overrepresentation. So some of the issues that impact LGBTQ homeless youth obviously is regarding safety and how well they're able to access services. A lot of the reason why we don't see the full picture of LGBTQ youth homelessness is because of a lack of a database between youth shelters, the amount of hidden homelessness, so couch surfing, staying over after, procurement or sex work and then staying over at the individual's home for the night, serving as a temporary solution to homelessness, or other things that cause hidden homelessness. We don't know the full picture, but safety, homophobia and transphobia in shelters, and not being able to access services and supports. We know that there's a lack of supports, and even in Toronto with the 519 and even with Hamilton with the Youth Wellness Centre, there's still a lack of services regarding accessing safe places, accessing food, accessing mental health, and all the other things that come into play to serve youth. Coming out is a really difficult process when you are in a shelter. That could put you at risk with other individuals at the shelter or even with the staff there. A lot of shelters in Ontario and specifically in Hamilton have designate floors based on genders. That causes a huge impact if you're an individual who is gender non-binary or trans, trying to understand and navigate where it's safe for you to even stay. With the Wesley Youth Housing, for example, they have pods, so 4 pods with designate male beds and a pod for 4 beds designate female. So if they have an individual who says, I feel safest and I am safe if I were to stay in the pod designate for a female and there's no beds, and what if the safety concern is I'd like to have a pod that's just for my own? The services aren't built like that. So we already have, based on the infrastructure, a lot of limitations and barriers as to how we can ensure that the person feels safe. So coming out and even exploring one's gender and sexuality is made even more difficult by the structure of the... All right, I guess I appreciate your honesty, like I'm not coming back here and we're not renting here. Now, I had the privilege of having a beard, so to speak, with me. But I fear if I ever have to look in the future with my partner, how I'm going to be perceived. I have the privilege of possibly going by myself and applying for a place by myself. But if I didn't have the privilege to do so, or if I didn't feel comfortable to do so, I may face, a lot of people do face, a considerable amount of barriers. I know friends who have been discriminated by landlords after they've rented the place, and it becomes apparent that they are a couple. It becomes difficult if an individual does not have passing privilege and therefore experiences discrimination. Again, there's not a lot of recourse or solutions for that. In Canada, there's about 335,000 LGBTQ senior citizens, and they're going to be transitioning into a time where they're going to be thinking about long-term residential care. They're going to be thinking about retirement homes, and they're going to be concerned and worried about a tremendous amount of issues, including the fear of discrimination and victimization by the staff that are meant to care for them, heterosexism, sexual orientation and gender identity, which could be challenged by workers. So In general, there's already an issue with workers not understanding sexuality when it comes to seniors. They assume seniors are not sexual in any way and should not express their sexuality, but that is made even more difficult when now the sexuality is queer. So a lot of workers might ask them to hide their gender or their sexuality, thus putting them back in the closet, which is triggering and very traumatizing. There aren't a lot of social supports for aging queer individuals, and with the lack of social spaces in general, it's more difficult when you want something else. Ensuring that we do better fund research and we better fund services, and that we connect with all levels of leadership. So that involves the city, that involves upper management of agencies, and that we make very clear what our demands are and what our needs are before it becomes too late that these are just secondary thoughts. But unfortunately, there aren't a lot of quick legal recourses in order to protect people who are facing the plethora of issues that I kind of touched on.
Do you know if there's any initiatives underway in Hamilton to provide any specific shelter options for LGBTQ youth?
No. About 5 years ago, the Notre Dame had the issue of there was an individual who was transitioning, and they had no idea what to do in terms of which floor this individual should stay on. I would rather have had them build a policy and procedure in advance to that, and not on the day that the individual was asking, where am I supposed to sleep tonight? I don't feel safe. Everyone, and I've never seen any sort of discrimination on that front. The YWCA has and currently serves many trans women in our community. But with regards to youth, it's a slow uptake, and it's very frustrating how slow that uptake is. And it's on a as it occurs basis, and that's really disturbing.
Kind of given the demographics, specifically with youth homelessness being pretty I can see that happening again, due to kind of how we desexualize seniors. But yeah, in terms of trans and queer kid homelessness, that's hard.
Yeah.
So the legal system, it doesn't take 10 years. So I'm a lawyer, I've been a lawyer. I graduated in 2000, I deal with human rights issues all the time. My name is Ryan, I'm Executive Director of the HIV and AIDS Legal Centre at Calco. It doesn't take 10 years. The human rights system was changed radically about 10 years ago now, so people have direct access to the Human Rights Tribunal. So if a tenant is dealing with issues, they might be able to go to the Landlord-Tenant Board, but depending on the issue, they might be able to go to the Human Rights Tribunal. And in Hamilton, you have a great legal clinic. It's there used to be 3, they amalgamated, but they led the amalgamation. I know the folks there. I imagine some people are not happy with them, like some people are not happy with any agency or organization. But there's also the Human Rights Legal Support Center that provides free services that's not income tested for people that want to file human rights complaints. And there's good reasons why people might not want to access legal remedies. It doesn't take 10 years, but it could take some time. It could take a year. It's at the very least a hassle, not to mention it could be, people could be re-stigmatized. People just might want to move on. There's all sorts of reasons why people don't decide not to take action, but it doesn't take 10 years.
I was referencing a particular case of accessibility and discrimination for an individual who's going through CIRA for an accessibility issue, and it did take 10 years because she didn't have the funds to be able to support her her legal team, and then there was an appeal process, and it did.
Yeah. So listen, some things that go to the Supreme Court, but your typical run-of-the-mill discrimination.
Sure.
There's issues with proving discrimination, right? So there's all sorts of problems with serving legal rights. But the human rights system is, from my perspective, my end, the adjudicators are more in tune with human rights issues these days. So, I don't want to be an apologist for the legal system, but there are some very real effective services in your town that remember that sometimes people forget that there are local services and they really should use them.
I'd be curious as to, like, with regards to being able to prove that to a degree that is necessary, like, in terms of, like, documenting discrimination and stuff like that, because it is so hard to prove, like, what's a typical case that ends up getting accepted, and what, I'm curious as to what are the ones where you can't prove it?
It's really hard. Sometimes it's a he said, she said, he said, what, right? And then, of course, there's a fear that the young person who's trans or, is dealing with some sort of, is using some substance or whatever it is out of the mainstream would be disbelieved by various players, right? But there are ways, sometimes there could be a witness. Sometimes somebody keeps really good notes. So it's really so fact specific, it's hard to answer that.
I guess the other thing though is, to think about, like, what's the remedy at the end of the day? Like,
Yeah.
if
You get a few bucks.
Yeah, you get a few bucks, but if you're a young trans person looking for housing and you feel like a landlord's discriminated against you in the application process or made a negative comment, yes, you can pursue that, but it doesn't fix your immediate need of where am I going to live, right?
Protections and they are going to build stricter guidelines, and there might be licensing.
Right.
Even then, I mean, it's difficult to prove, and just like you said, even if you pursue it and you're correct, there are individuals who put on Kijiji ads that say, we will absolutely not take anyone on Ontario Works or ODSP. You cannot discriminate on it based on the source of income. They're putting it in writing, and still there's no...
That's good proof.
Right?
And also, like, with the rental market, it's competitive as it is in many cities, it makes it even harder to prove, right? Because, so, I guess I'm privileged enough that, if I see an ad like that, I'm also sort of like, well, fuck you, I'm not going to approach you, right? Like, it's the point.
Depending on your income, you may not have that choice, right? Like in Hamilton, at the very least, 4 years ago, you could find a one-bedroom for $600, $700, and now I'd be hard-pressed to find one for $800, $900 for a client. So, doesn't solve your immediate need, even if you got a little bit of change in the legal process.
How many of, like, the shelters that do have spots for youth at the moment, I guess, at least advertise the fact that they are a positive space?
There's only one, and it's Notre Dame. That's the only youth shelter, and they do explicitly talk about safe spaces. It's hard to achieve, but it's absolutely one of their biggest priorities, and they have an LGBTQ concurrent disorders clinician that works out of the Youth Wellness Center and there. So that's an attempt to try to make it as safe as a place as possible. But I don't know, it's a tough place to live.
I don't know, and obviously I'm asking this question because I have no idea about the answer, probably should have, out of personal curiosity, tried to look it up on my own. But with regards to youth homelessness, in the instance where there is an identifiable guardian somewhere in the picture, aside from the minor not kind of coming forward to the authorities, to what extent, because I feel like with regards to youth homelessness, there needs to be kind of an enforcement by the government in some, I know that there are youth services and stuff like that, but it's just, go figure, I don't know, just, I'm obviously not a social worker, but to what extent can parents be forced to understand the fact that they...
If you are 16 and older, if you are 16 and older, CAS does not care, and they don't get involved. So the parent, there's really...
Well, sorry to jump in, I don't want to go into the conversation but Ontario just passed Bill 89, which will receive royal assent, so it's not coming into play until the fall. But it made a number of changes. So it repealed the Child and Family Services Act and enacted the Child and Family Services Act. I don't know why they changed the name, but so it deals with, it basically adds gender identity and gender expression as grounds on which parents cannot discriminate against their children, or CAS or foster parents can no longer behave in that way. What was really interesting to me is like CBC, things like that didn't pick it up, but of course like Breitbart and a lot of Christian publications picked it up and said, horrible things. They've also misreported it as saying that it no longer includes religion. It does. Religion is just put under creed. So now it's, instead of the parent being able to guide the child's education and religious upbringing, the parent has to think the best interest of the
Brennan House does take children under 16, and if there is a guardian that has disowned a child or has abused or violated a child on those grounds, then they would interact with the appropriate children's aid society. But if you age out, there's not much for you.
Yeah, that seems so different in terms of argument, because obviously the parental argument could be well, I think I'm doing the best for my child by enforcing X, Y, and Z. So that's kind of, I think that's obviously kind of cool that they shifted the wording in such a way that makes it more child-centered.
Giving more of a voice as to how they identify. And then, of course, they still have very specific definitions about what would constitute abuse within that. So, but yeah, a lot of Christian news sources are taking it and twisting it into the worst possible thing. There was some woman wrote about saying little Tommy goes to school one day and the teacher says it's okay to be a girl, and so then little Tommy goes home and wants to be little Trisha, and the mom says no, and so then the teacher hears about it and the child gets taken away. I was like, I'm not sure that I don't think that's going to work that way.
No.
Isn't the main focus on it to, if a child's in foster care and they're in a religious foster care family, and that... they have, it's kind of vague in a number of ways. I'm not super familiar with minors' rights and housing. But kind of more the emphasis is on what is in the best interest of the child. Is it actually removing them from that situation? What does the child want? And what can we really do to support that in the least traumatic way?
Yeah. And how easily can they make those things clear to their worker, right? Not have the means to be able to communicate that to a worker. How do you even, if your voice is being amplified by this legislation, how do you ensure that your voice is heard by the worker themselves? So absolutely, there's a lot of considerations about whether it's best to remove the child, and even if that's the case, how long did it take to get to that point? Because to imagine that a person would have had to have lived months or years through that before having another appropriate placement. There aren't tons of individuals, out there as foster placements. That's also another issue. So.
Do you know if CAS or CCAS actively try to recruit queer-friendly foster placements? I'm assuming CCAS probably.
A lot of funding was cut towards their programs regarding supporting foster families. So when there were cuts across the province for children's aid societies, that was one of the places in which that fell under. So that means you're cutting down on all of that. But the head of CCAS in Hamilton is queer. So I would hope that it's on his radar, but it may not be. But
He made it sound like it was when he presented at the research.
Yeah.
I don't suppose you happen to know, and again, I don't know if you know this, but say it's not deemed to be in the interest of the child to remove the child from the home, but there is some discrimination in some form, like what would the other options be? Education?
Probably, I would hope there would be something like education or some form of like therapy or other ways of supporting the child and supporting the parents who, for whatever reason, the parents are struggling with in terms of understanding. But I'm not.
That's not you, okay.
Yeah,
Sure,
that would
sorry
be
about
helpful.
that, yeah.
Who are you though?
Yeah.
Kate Dalton, Pride Hamilton. Sure. Sure.
Yeah, so are there any staff people, or is it all volunteer?
It's all volunteer. Again, we're using the AIDS Network kind of as our little hub, and just for the basic financial infrastructure. And there are 2 members of the Hamilton AIDS Network that are volunteering, but
Beautiful.
it's all. We just showed up one fine day and said, "Who's doing it this year? Guess it's us." Okay.
It's a bit more structured.
Well, okay, yeah. Yeah, Jesus, I'm hungry.
Andy Sprung, I'm not officially affiliated with Pride Hamilton, but I got
I like housing and homelessness research.
Hi, I'm Gabe, and I'm not affiliated with with Pride or with the AIDS Network anymore, but I spend a lot of time on there. It's how I connected with this, so I thought I'd come out.
I'm Brian, I'll introduce myself when I talk.
I'm Reggie. I'm a drag queen in Hamilton. I'm affiliated with the Imperial Court, but not necessarily with Hamilton Pride.
You'd be in Hamilton, considering how Hamilton people think of themselves. But from what I've seen, there's just like pretty much like the park day, and that's cool. But in terms of, we just thought that there needed to be more events to reach more people on different levels. Like we had a craft event, and but yeah, so and a ton of dance nights.